the sound that ended an empire. Remember to subscribe to our channel. Like this video and leave your comments below for more stories like this. The sound that made the silence in courtroom 4B of the New York City District Court so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights humming wasn't the judge's gavel or the rustle of papers. It was the soft, almost sinful pop of a cork. Richard Sterling, a man whose very being seemed sculpted from arrogance and the impeccably tailored fine wool of his custom suit, stood up with a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. His arm possessively draped around a woman who was most assuredly not his wife. With a flourish and a grace befitting royalty, he uncorked a bottle of cava, the sound echoing in the stunned silence, and proceeded to pour 2 delicate flutes. His mistress, Sophia Marin, giggled beside him, her eyes sparkling with barely concealed glee. He was there to finalize his divorce, to cast off his wife of 20 long years, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenient, irritating nuisance. But Richard never even got to taste his celebratory cava, because what happened next wasn't a simple settlement. It was an utter annihilation. Richard Sterling didn't simply walk into a room. He conquered it, he dominated it, he owned it. On that particular Thursday morning, he entered the hushed, quietly dignified, wood-paneled halls of the courthouse as if he were nonchalantly stepping onto the sun-drenched deck of his expansive yacht in the Hamptons. He was a living, breathing monument to his own self-proclaimed success, from the flawlessly polished gleam of his expensive Louis Vuitton shoes to the supremely self-assured set of his aggressively chiseled jaw. His suit, the ominous color of an approaching storm, provided a stark, almost aggressive contrast to the almost offensively cheerful disposition he wore like a carefully constructed, impenetrable mask. On his arm, clinging to him like a particularly devoted vine, was Sophia Marin, all of 28 years old, a full 2 decades younger than the woman she was brazenly helping to replace. Sophia was all sharp angles and meticulously crafted, modern beauty, a living, breathing, highly visible testament to Richard's perceived virility and overflowing wealth. Her dress was a cascade of fine crimson silk that clung precariously to a figure sculpted by relentless personal trainers and a life of carefree, consequence-free indulgence. She gazed up at Richard with the kind of wide-eyed, breathless adoration that only a man with a 9-figure net worth could possibly inspire. To the gaggle of reporters and gossiping legal assistants who whispered and pointed in the hallway, they weren't just a couple. They were a calculated statement, a flamboyant and spectacular announcement of a truly epic midlife crisis, one so over the top that it deserved its own reality television series. But the true spectacle, the audacious act of arrogance that would be talked about and dissected for years to come, was what his obsequious assistant carried with such carefully feigned nonchalance. A gleaming silver ice bucket from which the neck of a chilled cava bottle elegantly protruded. It was an act of theatrical contempt so profound, so breathtakingly audacious, that it quite literally stole the air from the already tense hallway. They weren't there for a simple legal proceeding. They were there for a self-aggrandizing coronation. Richard was blatantly celebrating the final, irreversible nail in the coffin of his crumbling marriage. Across the expansive room, almost rendered invisible by her quiet dignity and understated presence, sat Eleanor Vance. At 49 years of age, she was decidedly not the withered, broken woman everyone, especially Richard, expected, or perhaps even hoped to see. There was absolutely no sign of the stereotypical hysterical wife, no hint whatsoever of the jilted, weeping victim. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy dress that spoke of quiet strength rather than ostentatious mourning. Her blonde hair, threaded with subtle flecks of silver that hinted at hard-won wisdom, was pulled back into a neat, severe bun. Her hands, unadorned except for the simple, unblinking wedding band she had not yet chosen to remove, were folded calmly, serenely in her lap. She sat next to her attorney, Evelyn Miller, a woman whose quiet, almost unassuming demeanor masked a mind as razor-sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. Eleanor observed Richard's entrance, not with tear-filled eyes, but with a strange and unnerving serenity, a calm that bordered on unsettling. She saw the cava, she saw Sophia's triumphant, gloating smile, and she felt a wave, not of heart-wrenching hurt or debilitating anger, but of profound, almost detached pity. He still didn't understand. After all this time, after everything she had patiently endured, after everything they had painstakingly built together, he still saw her as nothing more than a disposable domestic accessory he was now so carelessly discarding. The courtroom slowly filled with the hushed whispers and rustling papers of the soon-to-be involved. Richard and Sophia took their seats at the plaintiff's table, radiating smug satisfaction. His lawyer, a burly, equally self-satisfied man named Charles Evans, arranged his files with an almost theatrical flourish, a blatant display of confidence. Evans gave a polite, yet undeniably condescending, nod to Evelyn Miller, dismissing her with a glance. He saw this as a textbook open-and-shut case, a high-net-worth divorce where the non-earning spouse received a generous, but strictly limited buyout. He had handled dozens of them over his long and lucrative career. The men, in his experience, always won. The booming voice of the bailiff echoed through the room. "All rise." Judge Helen Parker walked in with a purposeful stride. She was a woman in her late 60s with a well-deserved reputation for not suffering fools gladly. Her piercing eyes scanned the room, pausing for a barely perceptible fraction of a second on the gleaming kava bucket at Richard's feet. A flash of something unreadable, annoyance, amusement, momentarily flickered across her face before she assumed her place on the bench, her expression hardening into a stony mask of unyielding judicial authority. "You may be seated," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Richard leaned in conspiratorially to Sophia and whispered, his voice carefully calibrated to be just loud enough for the first few rows to overhear. "Get ready to toast your new life, my love." He punctuated the statement with a wink. Eleanor closed her eyes for a single, elongated second. She wasn't praying. She was remembering the very beginning, before the imposing marble and glass towers of their success, before the corrosive contempt and the ostentatious kava. She was remembering a small, cramped apartment that always smelled faintly of paint thinner and ambitious dreams, and the young man who had once earnestly promised her the world, never even remotely imagining that one day she would be the legal owner of it. The king and his queen. 25 years ago, Richard Sterling was not an industry titan, not a force of nature. He was simply a man with boundless energy, an undeniably charming smile, and conspicuous holes in his worn-out socks. He was a struggling contractor with a beat-up pickup truck and an audacious dream, desperately trying to get his small, fledgling construction company off the unforgiving ground. He met Eleanor Vance in a local unglamorous hardware store. She was no pampered socialite. She was a brilliant architectural history student with a burning passion for innovative design and an uncanny eye for untapped potential. He was buying basic drywall. She was meticulously sketching the intricate buttresses of an old, neglected building across the bustling street. He fell instantly, irrevocably for her quiet intelligence, her unassuming grace, and the unique way she saw the world, not just as it currently was, but as it could potentially be. Their courtship was a whirlwind of intense, late-night conversations fueled by countless cups of cheap coffee consumed over sprawling blueprints spread out on their small, perpetually cluttered kitchen table. He had the raw brawn and the persuasive salesmanship. She had the visionary creativity and the meticulous attention to detail. "People don't just buy a house, Richard," she told him one night, tapping a well-worn pencil thoughtfully on a blueprint. "They buy a feeling. They buy a story of the life they desperately want to live." It was Eleanor who tirelessly convinced him to stop building generic, cookie-cutter houses and start crafting bespoke homes, each with its own distinct character and charm. It was Eleanor who, using her grandmother's inheritance, a modest but undeniably crucial sum of $50,000, provided the vital seed capital for them to buy their first dilapidated Victorian home in a forgotten neighborhood that no one else wanted to touch. Richard saw only a crumbling wreck, a money pit waiting to swallow them whole. Eleanor, however, saw good bones, undeniable character, and a bright, promising future. While he tirelessly managed the often unruly construction crews, she meticulously managed the soul of the entire project. She spent countless weeks researching the home's original history, painstakingly hunting for period-appropriate fixtures, and designing a floor plan that was functionally modern yet historically respectful. She wasn't simply decorating. She was creating the very product he was selling. When it was finally finished, meticulously restored to its former glory, it sold in a single day for triple their initial investment. Their company was officially born. Sterling Properties, Richard eagerly wanted to call it. No, Eleanor had said firmly, a rare moment of assertive confidence in those early days. It should be Sterling and Vance Properties. We are partners in this, your name and my name, together. Richard, still deeply in love and recognizing the undeniable truth in her words, had willingly, even gratefully, agreed. The name was officially filed, and the partnership was legally formed, with both of them listed as founding partners. That seemingly insignificant, yet undeniably crucial detail, signed on a seemingly inconsequential document in a forgotten City Hall office, was a solemn promise, etched forever in indelible ink. The next 10 years were a relentless whirlwind of unparalleled success. Sterling and Vance Properties rapidly became the premier name in luxury restorations and high-end real estate developments. Eleanor's distinctive design philosophy, a unique blend of classic elegance and comfortable, modern living, became their instantly recognizable signature. She was the quiet, often unseen force behind the rapidly expanding brand, while Richard was the public face, the one splashed across glossy magazine covers, shaking hands with influential mayors and powerful financiers. Eleanor was the one meticulously staging the properties, painstakingly picking the art, and hosting the intimate, strategically planned dinners where hesitant investors were subtly persuaded to sign million-dollar checks. She cultivated the crucial relationships that Richard then leveraged for further business opportunities. She ran his increasingly demanding social life with the same meticulous care and attention to detail that she used to design a luxurious living room, understanding that in their rarefied world, perception was everything. But success, as it so often does, profoundly changed Richard. The man who once genuinely valued her vision and respected her contributions began to subtly belittle them. Her tireless work became her little hobbies. The strategically orchestrated investor dinners she so painstakingly planned were dismissed as just parties. The $50,000 seed capital from her family was conveniently forgotten, rewritten in his increasingly distorted mind as a small, insignificant loan that he had long since dwarfed with his own undeniable genius. He began to believe his own carefully crafted press. He was no longer part of a team, no longer an equal partner. He was a solo artist, a king ruling his own meticulously constructed kingdom, and Eleanor was simply a decorative, easily replaceable part of his court. The first affair was with a hotshot architect 10 years his junior. Eleanor discovered it through a carelessly discarded hotel receipt stuffed in the pocket of an expensive suit. When she confronted him, her heart shattering into a million painful pieces, he didn't even bother to deny it. He apologized, not for the deeply personal betrayal, but for the unforgivable act of getting caught. He glibly called it a stupid mistake, a meaningless flirtation, brought on by the crushing weight of stress. He swore it would never, ever happen again. Eleanor, still desperately clinging to the belief in the man she had married and the meticulously crafted life they had built together, chose, perhaps foolishly, to forgive him. By then, they had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, and she desperately wanted to preserve their fractured family. But something essential, something irreplaceable, had irrevocably broken. The sacred trust that had been the bedrock of their partnership, both personal and professional, was irrevocably gone. A few years later, a different, potentially more devastating kind of threat emerged. A rival real estate developer launched a frivolous, but potentially damaging lawsuit against Sterling and Vance Properties. Their then attorney, a nervous, aging man named Robles, panicked. He nervously advised Richard that in order to shield his core assets from a potentially crippling judgment, he should temporarily transfer his majority ownership stake in the company to Eleanor. Her name wasn't on any of the construction permits. Her public profile was purely social. She's clean, Robles had argued, his voice trembling with anxiety. It's a temporary measure. We'll put everything in her name. A simple asset assignment. Once this whole thing blows over, she signs it all back. It's foolproof. Richard absolutely loved the idea. Felt clever, almost devious. He presented it to Eleanor as a brilliant, strategically sound legal maneuver designed to protect their family's legacy. He made her feel like his trusted confidant, his indispensable partner in this clandestine maneuver. "I need you, Ella," he had said, his voice oozing with the same sincere charm he had so effortlessly used back in his struggling hardware store days. "You're the only one I can truly trust to hold this for me." Eleanor, desperately wanting to believe that he still saw her as his equal partner, grudgingly agreed. She went to the lawyer's sterile office alone. Richard was too busy, closing a lucrative deal in Miami, and she dutifully signed the document, the post-nuptial asset assignment agreement. It felt cold and clinical, devoid of any emotion. She signed where the lawyer instructed her to, her mind focused solely on protecting her children's uncertain future. She never received a final, fully executed copy of the agreement. Richard reassured her that it was filed, a mere formality that was already being handled. The lawsuit eventually fizzled out, and life, as it always does, moved on. Richard never once asked Eleanor to sign the assets back to him. He never even mentioned the agreement again. Why would he? In his increasingly distorted mind, it was all his anyway. The piece of paper was just a meaningless formality, a bureaucratic hurdle. He was the king, and she was simply the obedient keeper of the vault. He conveniently forgot about the document, just as he had conveniently forgotten about her initial investment, her undeniable design genius, and her name etched alongside his on the company's founding papers. He forgot that a promise, once written into law, takes on a powerful life of its own. And in his arrogant forgetting, he had unknowingly handed her the keys to the entire kingdom. Back to the present. The courtroom buzzed with barely suppressed anticipation. Judge Parker adjusted her glasses and looked down sternly at the two opposing tables. "Mr. Evans, you may begin." Charles Evans stood up, a stocky man in his late 50s. He clasped his hands behind his back and slowly paced before the judge. He began in a smooth, practiced voice. "This is, in essence, a simple matter. We are here today to dissolve the marriage of Richard and Eleanor Sterling. While this is always a sad occasion, my client, Mr. Sterling, is prepared to be more than fair. He is a man who honors his commitments." He paused dramatically, letting the palpable irony of his statement hang heavily in the air, though he himself remained blissfully unaware of it. Mr. Sterling built a highly successful real estate empire, Sterling and Vance Properties, from the ground up, through his own tireless sweat, his own undeniable genius, and his own considerable financial risk. Mrs. Sterling, for her part, was a devoted wife and an excellent mother. She created a comfortable home and supported him socially, as was her role. For this, Mr. Sterling is deeply grateful. Eleanor sat motionless, her expression unreadable, betraying absolutely nothing. Beside her, Evelyn Miller made a small, almost imperceptible note on a legal pad. Evans continued, his voice swelling with carefully manufactured magnanimity. "Therefore, my client is offering a settlement that can only be described as exceptionally generous. A one-time payment of $10 million, the deed to the family estate in Cabo San Lucas, fully paid, and a $50,000 per month spousal support payment for the next 10 years. Your Honor, this is a package that will allow Mrs. Sterling to continue living in extreme comfort for the rest of her life without having to work a single day." He turned slightly to look condescendingly at Eleanor's table, a smug smile plastered on his face. "It is a generous offer, a final gift in recognition of their years together. We believe it is more than equitable, and we hope the court will see it that way, allowing us to conclude this matter swiftly." He sat down with an expression of immense satisfaction on his face. Richard leaned back confidently in his chair, crossing his legs and giving Sophia's hand a reassuring squeeze. $10 million to him was a mere rounding error, the annoying cost of a tiresome nuisance, a small price to pay for his long-awaited freedom and for the entirety of the billion-dollar empire he so arrogantly considered his alone. Judge Parker looked down at Eleanor's table. "Miss Miller." Evelyn Miller stood. She was the physical opposite of Charles Evans. Where he was broad and loud, She was slender and serene. She didn't pace or fidget. She stood perfectly still, her quiet presence commanding the room through her sheer, unwavering concentration. $10 million, Your Honor. Evelyn began, her voice clear and precise, carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. We thank Mr. Evans for his performance. However, we are not here today to negotiate Mrs. Sterling's settlement. A murmur ran through the gallery. Evans's smug smile visibly tightened. Mr. Evans paints a picture of a benevolent king bestowing riches on a loyal subject. This picture is a fantasy, Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength. It is a carefully constructed narrative designed to erase my client's fundamental role, not only in the marriage, but in the very creation and ownership of the assets in question. We are not here to simply divide marital property, Your Honor. We are here to confirm legal ownership. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Richard uncrossed his legs, a flicker of barely concealed irritation crossing his usually unreadable face. What is this nonsense? My client, Eleanor Vance, is not seeking a gift from her husband, Evelyn said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. She is not the non-earning spouse Mr. Evans so dismissively described. The evidence will conclusively show that Ms. Vance was a founding partner of Sterling and Vance Properties. Her financial investment was the seed from which it grew. Her creative vision was the product it sold. And most importantly, as we will definitively prove with legally binding and fully executed documents, she is, and has been for several years, the majority and controlling owner of the entire corporate structure of Sterling and Vance. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Charles Evans leaped to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and outrage. Objection, Your Honor. This is absurd. It is a desperate and utterly fantastical claim. Richard stared at Evelyn Miller as if she had suddenly begun speaking in a foreign, incomprehensible tongue. He let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. Controlling owner? Is she insane? He muttered to Sophia, who was now looking nervously from Richard to Eleanor with a growing sense of confusion and alarm. Judge Parker held up a restraining hand. Mr. Evans, sit down. Your objection is noted, but this is an opening statement, not a sworn testimony. She looked back at Evelyn. Ms. Miller, you are making an extraordinary claim. I trust you have more than just rhetoric to back it up. Evelyn Miller nodded, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. Yes, Your Honor. We have documents. We have witnesses. And we have the truth. Mr. Sterling, in his overwhelming arrogance, appears to have forgotten the fine print of his own history. We are merely here today to remind him. She sat down. Eleanor looked straight ahead, her gaze meeting Richard's across the tense room. For the first time that day, the smug confidence in his eyes was replaced by a sliver of something else, a small, almost imperceptible fissure in the previously impenetrable marble facade. It was a look of dawning confusion mixed with an incipient, barely controlled rage. He had come to the courthouse for a victory lap, but his opponent hadn't even bothered to show up for the same race. She was running an entirely different one, and he had the increasingly nauseating feeling that she was already at the finish line. The paper trail of arrogance. Miss Miller, you may call your first witness, Judge Parker said, her voice cutting through the palpable tension of the opening statements. The plaintiff has no witnesses, Your Honor, Evelyn replied calmly. We believe the evidence speaks eloquently for itself. We would like to begin by submitting our first piece of evidence. Exhibit A. An assistant placed a thick document folder on the clerk's desk, who then handed it to the judge. Copies were quickly distributed to Judge Parker and a bewildered Charles Evans. This document, Your Honor, Evelyn explained, is a certified copy of the original Articles of Incorporation for a company called Sterling and Vance Properties Incorporated, filed with the Secretary of State 24 years ago. Richard squinted at the document that Evans slid to him. He remembered the antiquated name, of course. It was a sentimental choice from a long-forgotten past life. It didn't mean anything now. As the court can clearly see, Evelyn continued, there are two founding partners listed with equal shares, Richard Sterling and Eleanor Vance. Not Eleanor Sterling, the dutiful wife, but Eleanor Vance, the individual, using her maiden name. Evans stood up, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. Your Honor, this is a historical document. It reflects the state of the company 2 decades ago. It means absolutely nothing now. Sterling and Vance Properties has undergone numerous restructurings, mergers, and the creation of a dozen subsidiaries and a primary holding company. This ancient artifact has no bearing whatsoever on the current corporate structure. Evelyn waited patiently for him to finish his impassioned, albeit inaccurate, speech. On the contrary, Your Honor, the foundation is everything. This document definitively establishes from day one that this was not Mr. Sterling's solo venture. It was, in fact, a true partnership. But Mr. Evans is correct that this is only the beginning of the story. Let's turn now to the initial capital that funded this very partnership. She turned her unwavering attention directly to Richard. Mr. Sterling, in your sworn deposition, you claimed, under oath, that you started your company with your own meager savings and a small, inconsequential loan from your father. Is that correct? Richard leaned forward, speaking confidently into the microphone. That's right. 100% correct. I built it all alone, brick by agonizing brick. Are you absolutely certain that you received no significant financial assistance from anyone else, specifically from Eleanor or her family? Absolutely not, Richard said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Her family didn't have that kind of money. It was me. All me. I see, Evelyn said softly, almost pityingly. Then perhaps you can explain Exhibit B. Another document was presented. This one was noticeably older. The paper yellowed with age. It was a handwritten letter. This, Evelyn announced, her voice ringing with quiet triumph, is a letter from Eleanor's late father, David Vance, to his bank, dated April 12, 1999. We have meticulously authenticated the signature. In it, he authorizes a cashier's check to be issued from his retirement account in the amount of $50,000. Evans stood up again, sputtering with indignation. Objection, hearsay, and utterly irrelevant. A letter from a deceased man to his bank doesn't prove anything about where that money ultimately went. Patience, Mr. Evans, Judge Parker warned, her eyes fixed intently on the document. The letter goes on to say, and I quote, Evelyn read, her voice clear and unwavering. This check is to be made out to both Richard Sterling and Eleanor Vance to serve as the initial capital investment for their new joint business venture. And Your Honor, she continued, attached to this letter is a copy of that very cashier's check, painstakingly obtained from the bank's meticulously kept records. It is clearly endorsed on the back by 2 signatures, Richard Sterling and Eleanor Vance, and it was indisputably deposited into the very first corporate account of Sterling and Vance Properties. The courtroom was utterly silent. All eyes were riveted on Richard. His face, only moments ago so supremely confident, was now flushed with a deep-seated, barely suppressed fury. He had grown so accustomed to telling his carefully crafted rags to riches story for so long that he had actually come to believe the blatant fiction himself. This seemingly insignificant piece of paper was a ghost from a past he had deliberately and systematically buried. It was a gift, Richard blurted out, his voice far too loud, betraying his rising panic. David gave us that money as a wedding present. Evelyn raised a skeptical eyebrow. A wedding present, Mr. Sterling? You were married 3 years before this check was even issued. Furthermore, Mr. Vance's letter explicitly calls it a capital investment for a joint business venture. That certainly doesn't sound like a gift. It sounds suspiciously like a legitimate business transaction. A transaction, I might add, for which we can find absolutely no record of repayment. The first fissure in Richard's meticulously constructed marble facade had officially appeared. He was a liar. He had knowingly lied under oath in his deposition and had just been publicly caught in his deceit. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was undeniably a significant one. It severely damaged his carefully cultivated credibility and planted a seed of insidious doubt in the minds of everyone present. Charles Evans scrambled desperately to do some much-needed damage control. Your Honor, my client, a man of immense success, clearly misremembered the insignificant details of an event from a quarter of a century ago. This is a petty attempt to muddy the waters. $50,000, even if it was a loan, is a mere pittance compared to the company's current billion-dollar valuation. It's a simple rounding error. Is a foundation a rounding error, Mr. Evans? Evelyn countered softly, her voice laced with subtle steel. Or is it the most crucial part of any structure? That $50,000, wisely invested in the properties meticulously designed by my extraordinarily talented client, yielded a 300% return in less than 6 short months. That initial profit, not Mr. Sterling's supposedly hard-earned savings, is what actually funded the company's rapid expansion. The entire empire is, in fact, built squarely on that very foundation. A foundation built with my client's money and my client's undeniable vision. Judge Parker looked sternly from the damning check to Richard's furious face. She said absolutely nothing, but her expression was undeniably resolute. The narrative was irrevocably shifting. Eleanor Vance was no longer a simple, grasping housewife meekly asking for a handout. She was a founding partner whose initial crucial contribution had just been definitively proven, and whose arrogant ex-husband had just been caught lying about it in open court. Richard felt a cold knot tighten menacingly in his stomach. He glanced anxiously at Sophia. The wide-eyed adoration in her eyes was now noticeably mixed with a hint of confusion and a growing sense of unease. This wasn't the quick, clean execution he had confidently promised her. This was rapidly getting complicated. For the first time that day, he felt a pang of genuine, unnerving unease. He had severely underestimated Eleanor. Or, more accurately, he had tragically forgotten exactly who she truly was. And he was beginning to strongly suspect that her quiet, unassuming lawyer had a great deal more to say, and that none of it would be remotely pleasant. The true architect. Evelyn Miller deliberately let the full impact of the first devastating revelation sink in before continuing her relentless assault. Her method was calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. She wasn't attacking with a crude sledgehammer. She was meticulously dismantling Richard's carefully constructed fortress brick by painstaking brick. Now that we have definitively established the initial financial foundation of Sterling, let's move on to Advanced Properties' creative origins, she stated, addressing the judge directly. Mr. Sterling has consistently portrayed himself as the sole visionary behind the company's remarkable success. She then motioned towards a large screen that dominated one side of the courtroom. We would like to present Exhibit C to the court at this time. A series of images then began to fill the screen. There were layouts from prominent design and business magazines, showcasing photographs of sparkling glass and steel residences, beautifully restored historic buildings, and lavish condominium developments. And in almost every single one of those photographs featuring a person, it was Richard. Richard wearing a hard hat, standing proudly on a construction site. Richard in a corporate boardroom emphatically pointing at a scale model. Richard graciously accepting yet another prestigious award. As you can plainly see, Evelyn stated, the public narrative has been meticulously crafted. Mr. Sterling is the face, and indeed the very name of the Sterling and Vance brand. Charles Evans smirked, seemingly unfazed. Ms. Miller is simply proving my point for me. The undeniable evidence of my client's success is simply overwhelming to ignore. I'm not finished just yet, Mr. Evans, Evelyn replied in a cool tone. Now, let's take a closer look at the real work that made all of that success possible. She then announced, we call our next witness, Mr. Frank Hernandez, to the stand. A moment later, an elderly gentleman, likely in his 70s, with a warm, kind face and hands that bore the marks of years of hard labor, slowly made his way to the witness stand. Mr. Hernandez, Evelyn began, her voice gentle. Could you please state your occupation for the court, sir? I was a project manager, he replied, his voice clear and remarkably steady. I worked for Sterling and Vance Properties for 18 years, right from the very start. I was their third employee, actually. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. During your time there, you oversaw the construction of more than 50 properties for the company. In your professional opinion, who was ultimately responsible for the core design concepts, the aesthetic selections, the material choices, and the final staging that made those properties so incredibly desirable? Evan immediately rose to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is being asked to speculate about matters beyond his direct professional experience. Judge Parker quickly snapped back. Overruled. He may answer the question as it pertains to his direct experience. Hernandez looked directly at the judge, his eyes clear and unwavering. In the early days, it was all Mrs. Sterling Eleanor. She had an incredible eye for design. Richard was great at getting the necessary permits and effectively managing the various subcontractors. But Eleanor was the one who truly made the places special. She'd find some incredible antique mantelpiece at a salvage yard, or sketch out a completely new kitchen design on a napkin that was absolutely perfect. She personally picked out every paint color, every tile, and every light fixture. We didn't really call it staging back then, but she was the one who furnished the very first model homes, using pieces right out of her own house. That's what sold those properties. Evelyn nodded in agreement. And as the company grew, did her role begin to diminish in any way? Not at all, Hernandez quickly replied. It just got bigger, if anything. She personally hired and directly managed the entire interior design team. Nothing was ever ordered, and no blueprint was ever finalized without her explicit sign-off on the aesthetic side of things. Richard handled the money and the scheduling, of course, but Eleanor was the one who truly created the product. All of us on the inside knew it. She was the heart and soul of that company. Evelyn allowed his words to resonate in the courtroom before asking her final question. Mr. Hernandez, why are you no longer with Sterling and Vance Properties? The old man's face became noticeably sad. Mr. Sterling let me go a couple of years ago. He said they were streamlining operations and that my pension was becoming too expensive for them to carry. After I'd worked for him for 18 long years. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. No further questions at this time. Evans declined to cross-examine, knowing that Hernandez was a sympathetic and extremely credible witness who would only do more damage to his case if questioned further. Evelyn then called a local catering vendor, who testified in detail about the dozens of investor events that Eleanor had personally hosted, providing detailed menus and comprehensive guest lists that corresponded directly to major funding deals. After that, she called a former junior designer, who tearfully recounted how Eleanor had mentored him, and how his original designs were often presented to Richard by a senior designer who conveniently took all of the credit for them. The overall picture was becoming painfully clear to everyone in the room. Eleanor was not simply a socialite housewife who threw parties. She was, in fact, an uncredited executive, the lead creative director of Sterling and Vance Properties, whose invaluable contributions had been systematically and deliberately erased from the official company history. Richard was absolutely furious. He felt as if his power, his reputation, and his very identity were all being publicly dissected and relabeled against his will. This was no longer about just the money. It was about his legacy, the empire he had carefully built, brick by brick over the years. Evelyn Miller then returned to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper. Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence regarding the foundational identity of this company, she announced, her voice strong and confident. It is something so incredibly obvious that it has remained hidden in plain sight for the past 24 years. She held up the paper for the court to see. It was a close-up of the Sterling and Vance Properties logo. Sterling and Vance, she said, her voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. We have clearly established that Sterling is for Richard Sterling, and Vance is for Eleanor's maiden name. Mr. Sterling, in his numerous public interviews, has often been asked about the origin of the company's name. He has consistently claimed that Vance was chosen either because it denotes durability or because it simply sounded long-lasting and elegant. A clever branding strategy, he always claimed. She paused, looking directly at Richard. But we believe that there is something far more significant at play here. We believe that the name itself is, in fact, a contract, a promise of partnership, a fundamental truth that Mr. Sterling has spent the last decade desperately trying to forget. She then placed the paper back down on her table, But our most damning piece of evidence has yet to be presented, and it goes far beyond just the company's name or its well-documented history. It concerns its current legal ownership, a matter that Mr. Sterling himself meticulously arranged. The last piece of evidence. Charles Evans scoffed, a nervous, forced sound escaping his lips. Ownership, Your Honor? This is becoming more ridiculous by the minute. The actual ownership of FDP Holding Corporation is held within a series of incredibly complex trusts designed by some of the best financial minds in the entire country. My client, Mr. Sterling, is the sole beneficiary of those trusts. It's completely unassailable. Is it, Mr. Evans? Evelyn asked, a subtle glint in her eye. Because we happen to have in our possession a document signed by your very own client that definitively states otherwise. Richard's blood instantly ran cold. Asterisk the lawsuit. The clever lawyer. Robles. The document he had Eleanor sign to protect the family star. He had a vague, almost nauseating recollection of it. He had seen it as a clever trick, a temporary shell game of sorts. It had never even occurred to him to reverse it. Why would it? He was in charge, after all. She was his wife. It was all his. The nauseating knot in his stomach tightened into a solid ball of ice. He glanced over at Eleanor. Her serene expression hadn't changed in the slightest. But now he finally understood it for what it was. It wasn't simply calmness. It was absolute certainty. Ms. Miller, to what specific document are you referring? Judge Parker asked, her voice now tinged with an impatient curiosity. The courtroom was as quiet as a tomb. We would like to submit as evidence Exhibit F, Your Honor, Evelyn stated calmly. It is a postnuptial asset assignment agreement, dated May 14th, 7 years ago. Charles Evans's face visibly went white. He shot a frantic look at Richard, who felt a jolt of pure adrenaline coursing through his veins. The kind of adrenaline that precedes a major car crash. He knew the document, of course. He had meticulously orchestrated its creation, but he hadn't actually looked at it in years. He had completely forgotten the specific details. Trusting in its intended purpose to temporarily shield him from legal liability, he had simply let it slide. The clerk handed the document to Judge Parker, and a copy to Evans's table. Evans snatched it up, his eyes frantically scanning the dense legal text with growing horror. Your Honor, Evelyn began to explain. 7 years ago, Sterling and Vance Properties faced a significant, though ultimately unsubstantiated, lawsuit. On the advice of his then attorney, Mr. Sterling decided to legally insulate his assets. The solution he chose was to temporarily transfer his majority interest in the primary holding company, the entity that owns all of the subsidiaries, every single property, every single dollar, into his wife's name. A wave of gasps spread throughout the gallery. Sophia's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth in shock. Evans finally found his voice, stammering. A temporary transfer, a common asset protection strategy. It was always intended to be a temporary transfer, with the clear understanding that the assets would be immediately returned to Mr. Sterling once the legal threat had been completely resolved. The law, Mr. Evans? Evelyn countered, her voice dangerously soft, doesn't concern itself with vague understandings or unwritten agreements. It concerns itself with what is explicitly written and formally signed. Please direct your attention to page 4, section 3, subsection B. Evans's fingers fumbled desperately with the pages. Judge Parker was already there, her finger precisely tracing the relevant lines of text. The clause, Evelyn said, her words like hammer blows, stipulates the specific conditions under which the assets would revert to Mr. Sterling. It states that the ownership will be transferred back only upon a joint written request submitted to the corporate trustee by both parties, Mr. Richard Sterling and Mrs. Eleanor Vance. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang heavily in the air. Your Honor, we have submitted an affidavit from the trustee confirming that no such joint request was ever made or even attempted. Richard's mind was racing, desperately trying to find some way to climb out of the meticulously constructed trap. She was supposed to sign it back, he whispered urgently to Evans, his voice barely audible. Did you ever present her with a document to sign the assets back over to you, Mr. Sterling? Evelyn asked, as if she had somehow overheard his frantic whisper. Richard was trapped. He hadn't. Once the lawsuit faded into distant memory, he had become completely consumed by a new, mega-sized project in Miami. The document, the transfer, it had all simply slipped his mind. An administrative detail, nothing more. He was the king, after all. Paperwork was for commoners. He had never even imagined that his queen, the quiet, subservient woman he had always taken for granted, would ever even think to use the significant power he had so carelessly handed over to her. Evans, sweating profusely, tried another desperate angle. Your Honor, this document was clearly signed under duress, the duress of a lawsuit, and was presented to Mrs. Sterling by my client's own attorney. She had absolutely no independent legal counsel at the time. The agreement is inherently unreasonable and should be immediately nullified. It was a decent legal argument, a fairly standard one in such cases. However, Evelyn Miller was fully prepared for it. Unreasonable, Mr. Evans? She asked, raising an eyebrow. My client was explicitly told by her husband that he was acting solely to protect their family's legacy. He told her he was placing his ultimate trust in her. He framed it as an act of true partnership. She signed it willingly, sincerely believing that she was helping her husband and securing her children's long-term future. Then she delivered the final, crushing blow. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, Mr. Sterling was not the only one with legal counsel involved in this matter. Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit G. This was yet another document, a single, unassuming page. It was a letter. This is a letter from Eleanor Sterling to her husband, dated 1 week after she signed the asset transfer agreement. It was sent by certified mail, and we have the signed receipt right here. She cleared her throat. I'll read the relevant paragraph aloud. Richard, I have signed the papers as you asked. I trust you to know what is best for the security of our family. My only condition, as we discussed, is that this transfer is permanent. You have always said that everything you build is for the children and me. This document now makes that promise a legal reality. It is my and their security, in case anything ever happens to you or us. I consider this matter settled, and the ownership of the company now formally rests in me, per the agreement we both signed. Richard's jaw went completely slack. He had never seen that letter before. Never. Wait. Certified mail. His former assistant, Sarah, must have signed for it. Sarah, whom he had unceremoniously fired just 6 months ago after she had mixed up his lunch reservation at the club. He had a vague memory of her handing him a stack of mail, including several official-looking envelopes, which he had told her to simply file away. He never bothered to read them. He had far more important things to do. Your Honor, Evelyn concluded, her voice ringing with finality. Mr. Sterling received this letter. He never challenged it. He never replied. He never took any action whatsoever to reverse the transfer. By his own calculated inaction and prolonged silence, he legally accepted her terms. He was so utterly confident in his absolute control over his wife that he completely ignored a legally binding statement that effectively divested him of his entire fortune. He didn't forget. He just simply didn't care. He believed that documents, that laws, that the very promises he made simply didn't apply to him. She turned and looked directly at Richard Sterling, her eyes now filled with a cold, clear fire. He was wrong. The room was utterly silent. Charles Evans sank deeply into his chair, his face the color of ashes. He shuffled his papers, but it was a completely useless gesture. He was a general whose army had turned out to be nothing more than a cheap parade of cardboard cutouts. Richard Sterling no longer looked at his lawyer, or the judge, or even Eleanor. He was staring directly into the void, into the terrifying ghost of his own monumental arrogance. He had built an empire, it was true, but he had been far too proud to ever read the fine print. He had set an elaborate trap to protect himself, and then, in his blinding hubris, he had walked directly into it, pulled the string, and closed the cage door from the inside. And standing patiently outside that cage, holding the only key, was the very woman he had tried to discard as if she were yesterday's old news. The king is dead, Judge, he thought to himself, the words echoing in his mind. Judge Helen Parker took off her glasses and placed them deliberately on the polished wood of the bench. The simple action, small and neat, seemed to suck all the sound from the room. She rubbed the bridge of her nose, her eyes closed for a moment, as if in deep contemplation. To the gallery, it looked like a moment of prudent judicial reflection. To Richard Sterling, it felt like an eternity in the electric chair. The judge wasn't just considering the facts of the case. She was carefully gathering the full weight of the consequences she was about to unleash. When her eyes finally opened, they were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of the law itself, impersonal, relentless, and utterly absolute. She looked down, not at the lawyers, but directly at Richard, pinning him with a gaze that stripped away his tailored suit and confident facade, leaving only the scared, duplicitous man beneath. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice quiet, but with a cold, steel edge that cut sharply through the silence. "In my 20 years on this bench, I have seen a great many dissolution proceedings. I have seen acrimony, sadness, and unbridled greed. I have seen complex financial arrangements designed to cleverly hide assets, and I have seen simple ones designed to ensure basic fairness. But rarely," she paused, letting the word hang in the air, "have I ever seen a case where one party has displayed such a profound and willful ignorance of his own legal and personal history." Richard's throat went bone dry. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a complete and utter vivisection. "You sat before this court, Mr. Sterling," Judge Parker continued, her voice unwavering, "and under oath in your deposition you deliberately built a myth, a carefully crafted myth of the solo genius, the self-made titan who single-handedly forged an empire alone. You completely erased your partner, Mrs. Vance, from the narrative. You testified that your company's foundational capital was entirely your own when we have seen irrefutable proof, a cashier's check endorsed by your very own hand, that it came directly from the family of the woman you now seek to cast off. That was not a lapse in memory, Mr. Sterling. That was blatant perjury." Charles Evans visibly flinched as if he had been physically struck. His client had not just been outstrategized. He had been publicly exposed as a simple liar. The judge continued her meticulous dissection. "You then proceeded to minimize Mrs. Sterling's invaluable contributions to mere hobbies and inconsequential social duties. And yet, witness after credible witness, from your own long-term project manager to the very talented people who actually designed your products, have testified under oath that Eleanor Vance was not just an accessory to your extraordinary success. She was, in fact, its principal architect. She was not merely a partner in your marriage. She was the founding partner of Sterling and Vance Properties, a truth that has been hidden in the very name you proudly display on your buildings, a name you chose to deliberately misinterpret to the public." Richard felt his blood pounding in his ears. He could feel Sophia's stare at the side of his face, no longer adoring, but questioning, horrified. His mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, recalled a casual conversation from a year ago at the country club. He had been on a high, laughing boisterously. "The key to success," he had pontificated to his captivated audience, is never to let anyone else hold the real power. The details, the fine print, that's where you keep your kingdom safe. He had truly believed it. He had been utterly convinced that he was the undisputed master of all the details. Judge Parker picked up the postnuptial asset assignment agreement, holding it as if it were radioactive. "Which brings us to this particular document, the ultimate act of unbridled arrogance. Your attorney, Mr. Evans, argues that it is inherently unreasonable and was signed under duress. But the true duress, it seems, was your own. The paralyzing fear of a potential lawsuit. You used your wife as a legal shield, nothing more. You presented it to her as an act of complete trust, a way to protect the family. You made her the convenient vessel for your entire fortune, confident in your absolute power to command her to give it all back at will." She put down the document and then picked up the certified letter. "But Mrs. Vance, it turns out, understood the true power you had so carelessly given her far better than you ever did. She sent you this letter, a clear and unequivocal statement that she understood the transfer to be permanent. It was sent by certified mail, Mr. Sterling. Its delivery is a matter of undisputed legal record. Your primary defense is that you were simply too busy, too incredibly important to ever read your own mail. You delegated, you dismissed, you deliberately ignored. You treated a legally binding statement that altered the ownership of your billion-dollar empire with the same amount of attention you would give to a worthless piece of junk mail. She leaned forward, her voice lowering but losing none of its intense impact. In the law, Mr. Sterling, silence has significant meaning. When presented with a clear statement of specific terms, your abject failure to challenge, object, or even reply to it constitutes full acceptance. You had 7 long years to challenge this agreement. You had 7 years to submit the required joint request to revert the transfer. You did absolutely nothing because in your distorted world, Eleanor Vance was not an entity with her own individual rights. She was merely an extension of your own will. You didn't believe you needed to reverse it because you never truly believed that the power had ever really left your hands. It was the most expensive and devastating assumption of your entire life. The courtroom was now so completely silent that the frantic scratching of the court reporter's pen sounded deafening, like a wildfire consuming everything in its path. Sophia Marine no longer looked at Richard. She was staring intently at her own crimson-painted nails. The dream of a secure future as Mrs. Sterling was rapidly dissolving into a horrifying nightmare. The man she had so carefully latched onto was not a king. He was, in reality, a fool who had carelessly given away his crown and had then forgotten where he had even put it. Richard Sterling felt a cold wave wash completely over him, bringing with it a horrifying clarity. The walls of the courtroom seemed to be closing in on him. The smug confidence that had been his armor for decades had been brutally peeled away, and he was now naked and completely exposed. He looked directly at Eleanor. Her face was serene, as always, but her eyes held the undeniable knowledge of this day, a knowledge she had carried alone for far too many years. He had always mistaken her silence for submission, her extraordinary patience for weakness. Now he finally saw it. It had been discipline all along. Therefore, Judge Parker declared, her voice rising to a formal and deeply authoritative tone, this court is not here to divide the assets of Sterling and Vance properties, as there is quite simply nothing left to divide. The assets are not marital property subject to any form of equitable distribution. She stood, a black-robed figure of ultimate authority, and delivered the final, irrevocable verdict. Each word was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of Richard Sterling's carefully constructed life. Based on the documents submitted and duly verified, this court confirms that full legal and controlling ownership of FDP Holding Corporation and all of its subsidiary assets, including real estate properties and financial accounts, was legally and irrevocably transferred to Eleanor Vance 7 years ago. This is not an asset split. It is simply a confirmation of current, valid ownership. She took one last, sharp breath. The entirety of the assets are now legally hers. The silence that followed was like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of everyone in the courtroom. Then came the sound. The bottle of kava, forgotten and slick with condensation, slipped from Richard's nerveless hands. It didn't shatter dramatically. It hit the marble floor with a dull, sickening thud, the sound of a fallen monarch. The bottle of kava rolled ignominiously across the floor and came to rest near the witness stand. Its promise of joyous celebration now a mocking epitaph to Richard's shattered dreams. Richard opened his mouth to shout, to object, to rage against the impossible injustice of it all. But all that came out was a dry, raspy gasp. His power, his voice, his very identity had been brutally stripped from him. He was a nobody. Judge Parker hit her gavel once, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot through the graveyard silence. This court stands in recess. As she walked briskly out of the room, complete chaos erupted. Reporters scrambled for position. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Charles Evans slumped heavily into his chair, covering his face with his hands. His once promising career now reduced to ashes. Sophia Marine stood up, gave one last, fleeting look at the empty man she had so carelessly bet her future on. A look of pure, unadulterated contempt, and walked out without saying a single word. In the middle of the pandemonium, Evelyn Miller placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. Eleanor stood, her movements fluid and unhurried. She smoothed the front of her simple navy dress, a gesture of quiet finality. Her eyes met Evelyn's, and she gave a small, grateful nod. Her ultimate victory wasn't in the deafening chaos erupting all around her, but in the profound silence she had finally won for herself. She turned and walked purposefully toward the exit, not looking back at the man who was now just an inconsequential accessory in a life she was purposefully leaving behind. She walked out of the courtroom, not into the waiting arms of another man, but into the warm embrace of her own reclaimed future. The empire was finally hers. This story reminds us that true strength isn't always loud and boastful. Sometimes, it's found in the silent details, the patient planning, and the unwavering courage to wait for the perfect moment to reveal the ultimate truth. Richard Sterling thought he was simply closing a chapter of his life, but Eleanor Vance brilliantly showed him that he had never even bothered to read the book in the first place.